friends. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. Got to get oriented. So, welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanojia. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything we're going to discuss today is intended to be for educational or entertainment purposes, but hopefully a little bit more educational today as opposed to entertainment. I think couple of things to talk about. So just to give you all a quick heads up. So today we're going to be talking about post-traumatic growth. And yeah, so that's basically what we're going to be talking about. So I've spent last couple of weeks really looking into post-traumatic growth and sort of explaining a little bit about what it is, where the concept comes from. I think we've sort of accelerated this stuff kind of like internally at HG in terms of everything that's going on with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So I think we've been getting a lot of interest in this kind of thing. So we're going to be talking about that today. It's basically all we're going to be talking about because it's complicated. Before we kind of dive in, just a reminder, we're going to be on a completely normal schedule this week. So we're stream today, stream Friday. Couple of other things. Let me see if I can. There we go. So a couple of other things. We have group coaching spots open still. So if y'all are interested in learning how to introspect, learning how to help others and help yourself, sort of work on shared problem solving, party XP kind of stuff. So a lot of times people are kind of confused about what group coaching is. There are elements to group coaching which are really powerful. So one is that you're going to be working with other people, and hopefully we'll be working on kind of shared problems. You may have a piece of the puzzle, someone else may have a piece of the puzzle, and you can actually progress faster. I think one of the biggest advantages of group coaching is that oftentimes you can't see your own problems because of cognitive bias. And if we think a little bit about how people are able to be helped through HG, a lot of it, like when you see someone that we're interviewing, for example, talk about something that you yourself are going through, it gives you a unique insight into it because you're kind of an objective observer. So the cool thing about group is that that kind of effect can really happen. There are also other sort of evidence-based perspectives on why groups can be important. Irvin Yalom did a lot of good work on group therapy, and there's some of those kind of attributes about working together in groups that are not necessarily therapeutic in nature. They're just kind of group dynamic effects, which we try to take advantage of through group coaching. So if y'all are interested in that sort of thing, check it out. So today we're going to talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth. And the reason I want to talk about this is because there's been sort of an increased interest in this subject. And I think that what we're going to really explore today, my goal is to share a couple of core concepts with y'all, right? So once again, these are intended to be kind of educational in nature. So the first is, what does trauma do to a person? Like sort of scientifically, if you go through a negative event, how does that, what are the different dimensions on which that event impacts you? Because I think we sort of talk about trauma like it's like a homogenous thing, right? Like, so boom, I'm traumatized. Like, how does that relate to other people who have been traumatized? Is everyone traumatized the same? Is it like a linear scale where you get hit with 100 points of trauma damage versus 50 points of trauma damage? Because the truth is that trauma affects us in multiple ways, profound ways. And if we want to move past traumatic experiences, we have to start by understanding what are the ways in which trauma is affecting me. The second thing that we're going to talk about, once we sort of understand how trauma affects us, what changes it makes, we're going to touch a little bit on research, and we're going to touch a little bit on a clinical perspective, but that's not really the scope of this. So we're not going to talk about PTSD. And this is actually the core point of today's talk, is once we sort of understand when you go through something difficult in life, what are the different pathways you can take after that event? So this is something that's been an increased area of research in the last, I'd want to say 20 years. So as the emphasis on positive psychology has grown, as the emphasis on, like non-clinical perspectives within therapy have grown, right? So it's not just about restoring function or fixing something. A good trauma-informed therapist will help you make sense of your life. So how do we understand, like, okay, so if I'm going to have a traumatic experience, there's kind of a fork in the road. And one option is that I get PTSD. And these aren't necessarily exclusive, by the way. So you can still get a diagnosis of PTSD and still grow as a person. So it's not really either or. But if we look at how people respond to traumatic experiences, sometimes it causes like stress or negative effects. And for some people, it actually forms as like an opportunity for growth. And this may sound kind of weird, and like people sort of end up stronger than they were before. So a good example of this, and we're going to be touching on a couple of examples, is like cancer survivors are like a really fantastic example of, a cancer diagnosis is absolutely devastating. It means that you may be getting chemotherapy, radiation. Surgeons may remove a part of your body. It's terrible to live through. It's painful. There's constipation. There's nausea. There's looming chance of death. There's weakness, difficulty eating. It's just a terrible experience. And yet some people are able to come through that experience with a sense of like renewed positivity, zest for life, strength, resilience, are able to be inspirations and supportive to other people around them. So how do we sort of understand whether if I have something bad happen to me in life, like a traumatic experience, how can we start to understand which path I go down? Is this something that is going to cripple me forever? Or, not forever. Hopefully you can get treatment for it and stuff, even if you do get PTSD and you can get to resolution of symptoms. But what is that other element? Like, how do I go down that path of being like a cancer survivor? What does that entail? What are the components of it? And by sort of sharing with y'all what trauma does to someone, and then sort of exploring how we go down the post-traumatic growth path. So that's kind of the topic today, is post-traumatic growth. We'll sort of illustrate like what we understand from research in terms of, how do you move down a positive path? How can you have negative experiences in life and end up sort of like stronger for them? So the next thing that I kind of want to talk about for a moment is just to understand that if we think about growth, so oftentimes when we think about experiences that lead to growth, they are not necessarily positive experiences. And this has nothing to do with trauma. This is just if we're thinking about like, when have you grown in life? So people have done interviews, for example, with people who will sail around the world by themselves. Or people have done interviews with people who have climbed Mount Everest, right? And if you talk to these people, what you oftentimes find is that like some amount of difficulty testing yourself and getting to the limits of what you're capable of, and even going beyond the limits of what you're capable of, can lead to a sense of like very positive growth. It's not pleasant. It's not like fun, right? So it's not enjoyment. It's not dopaminergic. But we sort of know that human beings, when their limits are tested, can come out stronger and can grow as human beings. And that's also why we sort of call this term post-traumatic growth. It's not post-traumatic happiness or post-traumatic bliss. It's the idea that negative experiences can actually lead to our growth as human beings. So I just want to point out that this is kind of universal amongst people. It's not necessarily that trauma itself leads to growth. It's that challenging experiences lead to growth. And the other interesting thing about some of these challenging experiences is that oftentimes they're, chosen by the person who's doing it. So like when I decided to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, my sentiment, it's not that hard, to be honest, but my sentiment was like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. It's going to push me to the limits, but I'm going to feel great afterward. And I remember like my primary experience from climbing Mount Kilimanjaro was, okay, that was great, and I never want to do this ever again, right? Like I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I did it once in my life. Cool. And yeah, I'll take playing Lost Ark and Elden Ring any day of the week. That's not actually true. I still go hiking and stuff and still advocate for it. But so it's kind of interesting because we select for difficult and growing experiences. And I sort of want to use that as a backdrop, that growth and difficulty sometimes go hand in hand. And so the exploration of post-traumatic growth starts with sort of an understanding that like growth and difficulty are going to go hand in hand. Now, in the case of traumatic experiences, we don't choose them, right? We don't ask for them. We don't want them. And at the same time, that same principle of growth through adversity can still apply, okay? So before we kind of dive into the lecture portion, I actually want to share a post from our subreddit. And I think that this post actually highlights a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm a 20-year-old Ukrainian changed by war. So I've been following Dr. K for quite a while and love him in the community y'all have managed to build here. Good job, community. I'm a 20-year-old software engineer student from Kiev, and in my spare time, I love to game and watch stuff like PewDiePie or Sean McLaughlin. Like many of you, I used to have a hard time meeting new people, let alone going to parties. All that was caused or complemented by my long-lasting depression, keeping me from taking any kind of action to change the situation. My biggest concerns were the expectation of the future successes and annoyance of the past failures. I felt miserable. Sound like anyone we know? I've also been watching the war between us and Russia for years before that, and I was making predictions on whether the big attack will start or not. I thought it wouldn't. I was woken up at 7 a.m. by a phone call from my father, half screaming, half crying. Oh, hearing bombing while writing this. Guess I did make it through if you're reading it, haha. He was almost commanding me to come home where it was safer at the time. Just like most Ukrainians at this point, I panicked. It was hard to think clearly because the war has come. They are bombing my city. I'm hearing sirens. But I had already decided to stay in Kiev if the war breaks out and defend it with all I could. So I told my parents I wasn't coming back. My emotional state was full of not only fear, but anger and determination to give my life if need be. So that very day, I went to the local military office to voluntarily take arms and fight. There were so many people that I had to spend 3 days in the queue for a weapon, but still didn't get it. It's prioritized for the ones with military experience. All the time there I was kind of fighting my own enemy inside. One side of me was telling me to stop and leave Kiev, the other to give it all I got, even if it's my life. The cause is greater than any cost. The cause is safety of my people and my country. We have 1,500 years of profound history, and I respect that. It was paralyzing at times seeing my friends panicking, but I knew that fear is our first enemy. I started telling them how strong our army is and how well they are fighting back to cheer my friends up. Although it was hard, I showed no fear and only courage and confidence in our future success. And soon my friends started to rely on me and come back to me when they felt down and scared. I became their source of motivation and confidence. It had never happened in my peaceful part of life. It has changed. As many people left, I took a lot of responsibility, including taking care of my dormitory and volunteering at every opportunity I have. Hard decisions took place, and each of them changed some part of me. As I'm writing this, it's kind of hard to remember all my past struggles with depression I had before the war. It's almost like it's been years that we're fighting, although it's just 6 days. The fight has brung upon a lot of suffering, and we all have to mature to deal with it. It's hard, but it's making us stronger. I'm afraid that you will not take it right, but I'm feeling that like I've kind of become happier after the war started. I guess it's just the Ukrainians' war glory past, haha. Anyway, I just mean that if I really have none of my past depression and anxiety in these conditions, and I thought it was an interesting phenomenon for Dr. K to talk about. Thanks so much for reading. So, as I kind of I read this post last night, and then, doubled down. We were thinking about doing a lot of different stuff today. But I think double down on talking about post-traumatic growth. Because I think when I read this story, I think it's like I could not ask for a better example of the theoretical principles we're going to teach y'all about today. So I pray for this person's safety. I pray for everyone's safety who's in the conflict, near the conflict. I hear civilians are getting caught up in stuff now. I really hope that this person is okay. I really hope that this person checks in with us again, right? Because we're worried about him. And at the same time, I'm also incredibly proud of what this community has built, right? Because this is a person who came to our community, feeling, sound familiar in terms of this stuff. Sorry, I'm going to get emotional, but that's okay. Oh, whoops. Wrong things. I'm getting discombobulated chat. So this sounds like one of us, right? This is one of us. Long-lasting depression, anxiety, fear of my future successes, annoyance of my past failures. And so sometimes like people in this community don't realize that like this is us too. And this is what I've been trying to explain since I started streaming, is that like these people are not different, right? Although it was hard, I showed no fear and only courage and confidence in our future success. And soon my friends started to rely on me and come back to me when they felt down and scared. I became their source of motivation and confidence. It had never happened in my peaceful part of life, and it's changed. As many people left, I took responsibility, right? Hard decisions took place, and each of them changes some part of me. This is kind of like, I just can't illustrate this point better. So first of all, don't underestimate what you're capable of. You can feel behind, you can feel like a failure, you can feel like, you know, you're depressed and you're socially anxious and I'm trapped by like all of these things that I have to do, and you can feel incredibly miserable. But this is not truly who you are, and it will never be truly who you are. And something about this person's experience has transformed them, right? Like it has never happened and it's changed me. So what is the nature of like this change? How does this change come about? Unfortunately, I wish I could give y'all a clear answer. The best that I can do is like teach y'all theoretical concepts, but there's no way that I can impart upon you, and we'll talk about this as well, the experience that this person has had. And I'm not even sure that I would want to, right? Like I'm not sure that if this is the price of growth, I wouldn't ask anyone in our community to pay it, because this is a terrible price to pay, right? Like, and I mean, the price for this person's journey like may not be over yet, right? It's just starting. So I think this is just an amazing example of like what we're going to be talking about today. I don't know that I'll be able to do justice to this process of growth and change and maturation. I'm going to do my best to try to sketch it out kind of intellectually. Okay? So let's dive in. Emotions. Chat. I'm worried about people, but that's okay. Let us now use our intellectual defense mechanisms and talk about things theoretically so that we can feel better about ourselves and keep the emotions far at bay. Okay. So let's talk about post-traumatic growth. Y'all ready? Ready to dive in? Let's do it. Okay? Okay, so the first thing is that you don't actually have to like watch this, right? So I just want to emphasize that this person has made an internal transformation without this lecture. So the first thing that I want to say is have faith in yourselves. You don't need to listen to this lecture. You're not going to find all the answers here. You don't need to find all the answers here because you have all the answers within you. And when you are tested, I have faith in you. I have faith in this community. I have faith in the people here, and you will be amazed at what you're capable of. But we're going to talk about that too, okay? So let's dive in. So the first thing to understand is, so let me give you all an overview of today. So how does trauma affect us? Okay. Once we understand that, we're going to understand something about schemas. So this is kind of how we navigate the world. And once we understand how we navigate the world, then we can see how trauma will change us. Next thing that we're going to talk about, once we understand how trauma changes us, we're going to touch a little bit on research and clinical perspectives. This is going to be super short. On post-traumatic growth. Okay, so this is going to be number 1. This is going to be number 2. And then we're going to dive into a couple of key aspects of post-traumatic growth. So one is going to be meaning making. The second is going to be cognitive restructuring. Actually, we're going to talk about emotional growth. And then to tie things up, we're going to talk about 5 steps or components to move into post-traumatic growth, okay? So this is going to be what we talk about today, okay? So first of all, let's talk about how trauma affects us. Okay? So the first thing to understand is that we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of schemas. So these, I think, were really well developed in the cognitive behavioral psychology sort of explorations. I think schemas are also somewhat similar to samskaras in Sanskrit. So I think these are the two concepts from east to west that are the closest. But we basically have systems for viewing the world. And this is called a schema. So for example, like let's say I go on a first date. And if I'm on a date and like, you know, let's say, assume a heteronormative perspective for a moment. So I'm a man, I'm dating a girl. And, you know, on my first date, like there may be some like first date schema things. So what's an example of like first date schemas? Do I hold the door open? Do I pay? Do we split the check? Like I sort of have like a script. I have sort of like a roadmap, right? And then that may be different from like a Valentine's Day date. I mean, sorry, a Valentine's Day, date, right? So in this case, I'm going to get flowers. Or maybe you're a GigaChat and you get flowers at the very beginning. You get a box of chocolates. So we basically have these different sort of scripts that we use to navigate the world. So schemas are the way that we navigate the world. Okay? And so we form all these kinds of schemas. So we form schemas relating to the sense of self, right? So who am I? I have a way of like understanding who I am. We have schemas about the way we relate to others. And then we have schemas with the way that we interact with the world. So just to give you all like a simple example, you know, so I may believe certain things about myself. Like I believe like I'm a good person. We may have certain ways that we relate to other people. So I may believe, for example, that people are fundamentally trustworthy. Right? That like if I meet someone on the street and they say hi to me, that I don't have to be in, like I'm not in danger. Like people are fundamentally like safe and good human beings that I can interact with. And we can also have different ways that we interact with the world, like, you know, the ways that I interact with my boss, the way that I pay bills, taxes, like there are all these different ways in which we interact with the world. Like if I apply for a job, I think I have a decent chance of getting it. If I apply for a promotion, I have a decent chance of getting it so I can get promoted if I do a good job, right? So there are these beliefs that like getting promoted correlates with hard work. So these are all like, this is basically like how we navigate the world, right? We also have schemas about toilets. So like even if you've never seen a particular toilet, if you go to a friend's house for the first time and you've never seen that toilet, you still know how the toilet works, right? Like it's a toilet. You know how toilets work. How do you know how a toilet works? Well, those are schemas. And so we don't really think about the schemas that we have. They tend to form automatically. And once like schemas are very important because they relieve us of cognitive processing. So they make cognitive processing easy because you're not figuring everything out all the time. So imagine that you have amnesia of all the toilets that you've ever used. Now suddenly, like every time you go to the bathroom, there's this weird contraption, right? Like you don't know what is this. There's like this hole, there's like a sink, and then there's like this hole that has water in it. Like, what is this thing? Is this like a water storage tank? Is it, what am I supposed to do with this thing? You have no idea. So when we develop these schemas, we have like a cognitive processing burden that has been removed. So it makes it easy to navigate the world, right? Makes it easy to navigate the world. So what happens with trauma? So when we get traumatized, or when we go through a traumatic experience, what it does is alter our sense of self, alter our sense of others or relationships, and alters the way we interact with the world. Okay? So what will oftentimes happen is we'll change the way that we view ourselves. So for example, like victims of, sexual or physical violence will oftentimes feel like they deserved it. Feel huge amounts of shame and guilt. right? So this may sound harsh for me to say, but the primary emotion that most trauma survivors I've worked with is shame and guilt. And if you kind of think about like shame and guilt, those are like emotions that relate to your own actions, right? I don't feel guilty because I'm a victim. I feel guilty if I feel like I did something wrong. Shame has to do with it's kind of like my own actions are things that I'm ashamed of. So it's kind of bizarre, but like I used to believe that I was a good person, and after a traumatic event, as I experience shame and guilt, it alters my schema of the self. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens. So like when we have a schema of the self, let's say like, let's call this my schema of the self, okay? And after trauma, it gets split into like all these different pieces. So I don't really know who I am after the traumatic event. This is who I used to be. This used to be Alok. And now the A is over here, the L is over here, the O is over here, and the K is over here. And then what happens is much like a broken bone. So like, if I break a bone, and then it's going to heal, but it won't necessarily heal properly, right? So if I have a broken bone and I don't set the bone to heal properly, this is why we use casts and things like that, right? So we will set the bone. But if we don't set the bone, what it's going to do is it may start out straight, it breaks into two pieces, and then it ends up crooked when it heals, right? And so what tends to happen after trauma is actually a very similar thing, where like we don't actively put together the pieces of ourself. We don't actively put ourselves back together, right? We don't say, okay, the A goes here, and then the L goes here, and then the O goes here, and then the K goes here. That's not how we do it. So sometimes what happens is our sense of self gets fractured, and then without any intentional process, it just kind of like auto heals. And what it'll end up as is maybe like the A is over here, and then the K is over here, and then the L is over here, and then like the O is over here. Because there's sort of this automatic healing process that kind of strings things together, okay? And then like we're sort of left with this kind of fractured sense of self, which makes it hard for us to navigate the world in sort of a healthy and happy way. So it sort of shatters our sense of self. Second thing that happens is it shatters our sense of relationships and our ability to connect with other people. So this, once again, we'll just use one example of trustworthiness. So oftentimes, if you think about, like, let's say I'm going to go to my local gaming store for a game night, and I'm going to play a Magic the Gathering sealed deck tournament, or I'm going to play Dungeons and Dragons or Settlers of Catan or whatever. So like when I go to that place, I have a fundamental trustworthiness for the people there. Like I don't go there like armed, hopefully, right? Because I'm not expecting to get robbed. I'm not expecting to get kidnapped. It's like I may have to deal with some hygiene issues or something like that, maybe a touch of the nerd rage. But generally speaking, like these are going to be cool people that I'm going to hang out with. They're fun people. They're good people. And so I'm like trustworthy with the way that I hang out with them. I have nothing to worry about. After a traumatic experience, that faith in humanity too gets fractured into its components, right? So this is faith. We've got an F over here, an A over here, an I over here, a T over here, and an H over here. And then as it sort of reassembles, I may not trust people again. So we've seen this a lot in our community, especially when we talk to women in gaming, right? So this is the kind of thing where like when you're a woman and you start to play video games, like you start off and you're like, cool, like there's voice chat, there's party functions, there are friend systems, right? And then what happens is like over time, some experiences happen and it changes the way that you relate to people. So we've heard this story a lot where like people stop using voice chat, right? They stop making friends. They stay quiet. Because if they don't, something bad is going to happen, right? We're not saying that all male gamers are bad or anything like that. I'm not trying to demonize male gamers by any means. But we just want to acknowledge that sometimes people have these experiences and then it adjusts their behavior. That's the key takeaway. Maybe I stepped into a landmine myself by entering into gender dynamics, but I think it's like hopefully the point still stands. So this is where like, our trustworthiness of other people changes. So this isn't just other people. So for example, something that we use a lot when we're talking about the formation of Samskaras, we use the example of being bit by a dog, right? So if I get bit by a dog, how is that going to affect my trustworthiness of other dogs? So you may like when you see a dog, like how do you react to it? Do you have a normal like warm response to it? Or do you feel like scared and you want to pull away and things like that? So what happens after trauma is that our ability to trust other people, our ability to engage in relationships, also fractures into its constituent components. Last thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is the way that we navigate the world. So generally speaking, if you look at something called attachment theory, what attachment theory tells us is that people who grow up in secure environments, we've talked a fair amount about attachment theory. There's also a lecture on it in Dr. K's guide. And with good emotional mirroring, tend to be like more confident. They tend to be less neurotic or anxious. And why is that? So early on when you're a child and let's say I'm a kid and I trip and I fall and I get a boo-boo and then I cry and mommy or daddy comes running over and picks me up and comforts me, what I sort of learn is that, the world is a safe place. Like even if I get hurt, there are support systems out there. Those support systems will be very immediate, very caring, very supportive. So I don't have anything to worry about. Like the world doesn't need to be a dangerous place. I mean, I don't need to think about the world as a dangerous place because even if something wrong happens, I'll be okay. And if we talk about anxiety, like fundamentally, what is anxiety? Anxiety is like a lack of faith that things are going to be okay. That's why you have to worry so much, right? It's like if you think a little bit about, are you anxious about spilling water on your tile floor? Well, not really, because if you spill water, it's not that big of a deal. You can just wipe it up. It's not going to damage the floor, right? Versus if I have this fancy new carpet and I have a bunch of drunk people who are drinking red wine, am I worried about them spilling? Yes, because I'm more worried about that because the damage that gets done is going to be harder to repair. So when we grow up with sort of a secure attachment, what happens is we become really, really confident about going out and doing things. Like I can apply for jobs. I can apply for promotions. I can ask people out if I'm physically attracted to them. I can pursue romantic things. So based on my security and my sense of, okay, if I get rejected, does it mean I'm a terrible human being? No, that's based on my sense of confidence. So the way that we interact with the world once we experience a traumatic event can change. So this schema too gets shattered, right? Into its constituent pieces. And then when it reforms, we're not quite sure what to do, right? We don't know, it becomes hard to kind of navigate. And so the first thing to understand is that trauma affects us. So we're not talking about a clinical diagnosis of PTSD. That has different features like insomnia and anxiety and intrusive thoughts. We're going to touch on some of those things, but I'm just talking about on a fundamental level, when someone goes through an adverse event, it changes the way that we think about ourselves. It changes the way that we think about others, and it changes the way that we think about the world. So if you want to understand what trauma is, this is the best explanation I can give you. So then what happens is after the trauma, if we're not careful, we sort of redraw the lines of the schema. And these can actually be maladaptive or painful in some ways. So the challenge with the way that we sort of automatically redraw the lines is that they tend to be protective, adaptive, but over time can be painful and maladaptive. So I'll give you all just one example of this. So let's say that I'm married and my partner cheats on me. So partner has an affair. We get divorced, and then I learn to not trust other people. So in the very beginning, this can be a part of my healing process and can be adaptive because I don't want to get cheated on again. So I'm going to take a break from dating for a while. But then if I'm not careful, I can continue to believe that if I want to, and maybe that's what makes me happy in life. But if I lose the ability to trust other people, I also lose the ability to engage in future relationships that could be very fulfilling and make my life a lot better. So in the short term, the schemas kind of heal in a way that's protective and adaptive. But over time, if we're not careful, they can end up being painful or maladaptive. And oftentimes, when I work with patients who have had, especially like not active trauma, so I haven't had, huge PTSD oriented practices, but generally speaking, the work I've done with trauma tends to be like more of the later stage stuff, where what we're doing is sort of like revisiting prior experiences and understanding a little bit about, how has this thing that protected you early become something that is maladaptive now. Because remember, just like the bone that heals, like our mind heals for a reason, right? It does the best that it can at putting the pieces together. It's just not very intentional. It's kind of like automatic. And then we can end up with a schema that's kind of crooked. So this is where, essentially we're going to redraw the lines of the schema. And if we're not careful, like those lines of the schema can end up being painful or maladaptive. This is where there's a lot of interesting research that goes into, okay, what results in kind of like going this route versus more the post-traumatic growth route in terms of the automatic kind of redrawing of the lines that we do. And this is where there are all kinds of variables that go into like whether you manage a traumatic experience well or not. So first is that there are personality characteristics. So I'm not going to go too far into this, but just to give you all a simple example. So from the 5-factor model, which is probably the best validated theory of personality that at least I've encountered, high openness appears to be correlated with like positive responses after traumatic experiences. So the nature of our social support system also influences kind of like how those mental bones that have been fractured heal. The nature of stress is very important. So what is the nature of the traumatic event? Some events are more painful than others, right? So depending on what the traumatic event was, it may be easier to go down the post-traumatic growth route as opposed to the post-traumatic stress route. And then there's a lot of research that we're not going to go into today about spiritual perspectives. Or norms of viewing the world. So by having like a very, very good compass or lens through which I view why things happen in the world, it can be protective in terms of like helping me cope with negative experiences, okay? So just to kind of summarize what we've covered so far, trauma affects us. So we all have these things called schemas, which are sort of like the automatic playbooks that we use to navigate the world. They're our sense of autopilot. We have schemas about the self, we have schemas about how we relate to others, and we have schemas about how we interact with the world. When we have a traumatic experience, it changes the way that we view these three things. So we've got this playbook, right? Like, which is that, hey, if I play a video game, like I'm gonna have fun. That's part of my playbook. Until someone starts making some kind of misogynistic comment or, racial comment or misandric comment. And then once they like start to change the way that treat me in a different way, it changes the way that I view the world and I view playing games. And so that kind of fractures. And if we're not careful, it's going to reform in a maladaptive way. Okay. So that's how trauma affects us. Next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is research. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today comes from, I'd say, the seminal researchers in post-traumatic growth, who are Tedeschi and Calhoun. So they've written tons of papers, tons of books. We're going to be talking a lot about the work of Tedeschi and Calhoun. A couple of other things to remember just about research. So this is where we have to be a little bit careful because post-traumatic growth is still a disputed concept. So this is kind of important to kind of go into. So we know that stress can lead to clinical illness. And when we look at trials on dealing with things like PTSD, the way that we define clinical illness is impairment of function, generally speaking, right? So like How do I know whether I'm sad or I have clinical depression? Well, does it like actually interfere with your life or not? Are you unable to go to work because of your depression? Or is it just, you're just kind of sad and you're still able to enjoy things? You're still able to go to work. You're able to watch movies and have a good time. Your appetite is okay. You're sleeping okay. Okay, then it doesn't sound like clinical depression. So generally speaking, the most common element of clinical illnesses is some kind of impairment in function. So when we look at trials, right, so when we're doing research on things like PTSD, usually the benchmarks are restoration of function. Right? So if you're like operating at 50% and I start you on a medication and you then operate at 100%, that means that the medication is effective. So this is where in the clinical model, what we're concerned about is essentially like, here's 100%, here's 0%. And what we're kind of like concerned with is that during a phase of clinical illness, we're kind of operating down here. And the purpose of treatment, let's say I engage in trauma-informed therapy, and then people will administer some kind of like, symptom scale, and then they'll therapize me, and then I get up to 80%. And then the trial will be successful. So in a lot of the clinical research, what we look at is impairment of function and restoration of function. So this is one example when we look at post-traumatic growth of stuff that when people are doing, like good trauma clinicians do way more than this. They help people sort of, it's not just about restoration of function. A good trauma-informed clinician will help you sort of like navigate life in a healthy way. And this is where the post-traumatic growth research kind of comes in, because the post-traumatic growth is, I would say, sort of an offshoot of an emphasis on positive psychology. So this is where like therapy has changed a lot in the last couple of decades. And what some therapists sort of noticed is that we tend to focus on negative emotions in terms of mental health. So we're always looking at sadness or anxiety or fear or shame or guilt. But human beings have a whole host of positive emotions. And as the movement in positive psychology grew, people started to look at, okay, can a traumatic experience, the goal of a traumatic experience isn't necessarily just a restoration of function, but can we go beyond that to grow as human beings? And if so, because we've seen it, right? We just saw it at the beginning of today with that post from our subreddit. What are the elements that lead to growth as opposed to restoration of function? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And that's sort of to try to ground where this talk is coming from. So, this is where there's a lot of debate or exploration about, like, is post-traumatic growth a real thing? Is it not a real thing? Like, how good is the research? I mean, so it's an evolving area, okay? I just want to share that. So now we're going to go to some of the key components involved in post-traumatic growth, okay? The first is meaning making. So oftentimes when people are going through a tough time, they start to experience things like feeling bad, feeling empty, feeling directionless, feeling lost, right? Feeling even the doomer mentality, feeling nihilistic. I don't know why I'm putting nihilism in quotes. Right? So like there's sort of a lack of meaning. And this is where part of what we sort of emphasize in coaching, one of our primary outcomes is the discovery of like purpose and sort of trying to make sense of your life and giving your life a sense of direction. So meaning making is a very, very important part of the post-traumatic growth experience. So I want to share with y'all just a quote from Viktor Frankl, because he has a lesser known book called The Will to Meaning, which I think is a really good book too. But this is the tricky thing about meaning making is oftentimes sitting at home, we're like looking for purpose and meaning, but oftentimes the meaning doesn't arise until the crisis arises. So this is what's really interesting is that you can't sort of sit there and just find meaning. Oh, I mean, you can sort of, but it's very hard. But a lot of like meaning comes from our circumstances. So it may not be relevant until there is a crisis. Right? So we already have a great illustration of that if y'all, caught the first part of stream where we shared the story from someone in our communities from Ukraine. But this is the tricky thing about meaning making and finding meaning, is that meaning is something that has to be found. It's not something that can be given. Right? So you can't actually find meaning from watching stream as much as I would love to give it to you. So it also is something that has to be discovered as opposed to invented. So this is a distinction that Viktor Frankl draws. And so this is the tricky thing about meaning making, is that like you can't logic your way. I mean, maybe you can if you do a deep philosophical introspective kind of thing. But you can't just like logic your way to finding meaning in life, and no one else can kind of give you meaning in life. It sort of has to be found or discovered. There are some caveats to that as well, but it's kind of like tricky because it's not something that you can just say like, okay, I'm going to read these 5 books and at the end of it, I will have meaning. And so this is incredibly important for trauma, because especially in terms of post-traumatic growth, when you have a traumatic event, the issue is that like oftentimes the way we approach problems, so if I have a problem in life, if I have some kind of difficulty, what I try to do is fix the problem, right? If my toilet is overflowing, I need to unclog it. So we try to fix the problem. And this is a big part of just how we move forward in life, right? If there's a problem, we fix it. If I'm hungry, go eat something. If I'm thirsty, drink something. If there's a problem with my toilet, take care of it. If I've got, some kind of rodent infestation, take care of it. If I'm playing on ping, take care of it. If I keep wiping on Magritte, then I need to get good, right? There's just like, if there's a problem, you have to fix it. It's simple. The biggest thing about trauma is that this isn't a problem that can be solved. So trauma by nature cannot be solved. I mean, there may be some things you can do to affect change in the world. Like you can, for example, potentially stop the war between Russia and Ukraine. But all of the trauma that people have experienced is going to still be there. That's the real challenge with trauma. That's why it's so hard to deal with, because it's like, it can't be solved. So if you've been, physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, or someone has broken into your home, you can't undo that event, right? So you can never undo the trauma. You can't just like restore it back to where it used to be. There's no like save point. You can't just like load your saved game from 5 days ago prior to the trauma. And so the trauma also isn't really repairable, because once it's happened, it's happened. Like the effect is there, right? If you lose someone, like a loved one in war, like there's nothing you can do to bring that loved one back. Can you stop the war? Sure, maybe. But that's the really tricky thing with trauma, is that it can't be solved. And so since our standard function of like solving problems doesn't work with trauma, what we have to do instead is an intrapsychic process of meaning making. So we can't fix it, but we can try to make sense of it, right? Like we can try to like figure out, okay, what's the purpose for this? Like, how can I make sense of this kind of thing? And remember that the hallmarks of a lack of meaning are these kinds of words: directionless, lost, empty. So when we're talking about making meaning, what tends to happen through post-traumatic growth is that we'll sort of feel lost, we'll feel directionless. And then as we go through this like internal process of discovery, what we'll end up finding is like direction, purpose. This is where like some people will say, I've had patients who say this: cancer is the best thing that ever happened to me. And I'll be like, what on earth are you talking about, bro? They're like, well, it's made me like really appreciate, I was 38 years old. I got diagnosed with cancer, and I realized like life is like, I was just taking life for granted. And now I don't take a single day for granted. And every day that I wake up, it's a gift from God or the universe or whatever. And I make the most of my day every single day. And so it's kind of bizarre, but like we'll get to, that last part too. But through this process of meaning making, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that, we get a sense of like direction, purpose, and we can't really fix the problem, but that's why we're not going to try to fix it. What we have to do is make sense of it. And once we can make sense of it, we can integrate that into the way that we live our life. So we'll talk about that in the last step. So let's talk a little bit more about this kind of process of meaning making. So here's me. And then here are like reasons A, B, and C of why I exist. Okay? So I have a bunch of these schemas. This is the way the world works. I have a sense of self. I have a relationship to others. And then I have a way of navigating the world. Okay? This is reason A for existence. Reason B for existence. Reason C for existence. And then trauma comes along, and then now there's like a dissonance, right? Because now, like post-trauma, right, I'm sad now, or I have a mustache, whichever one. Like my sense of self is confusing. The way that I relate to other people is confusing. What to expect from the world is confusing. And suddenly these things don't feel relevant anymore. It's like, who cares about being the first person to level 60 on WoW anymore? Once, there's war in the world and climate change and stuff like that. So my reasons for existence become question marks. So this is where I used to be. This is where I am now. And so the discrepancy between these two places is why we feel lost. Because like everything used to make sense before the trauma. And after the trauma, it's like, I have no idea like what to do, what to make. I don't know why I'm waking up in the morning. I don't know why I'm going to work. Like I don't know these things. And so the process of kind of meaning making is like in combining these two perspectives. And then eventually what you end up with is like a new perspective where we haven't fixed this necessarily, right? These events still happened. These events are permanent. So what most people will try to do, and this is kind of how they get stuck, is they try to go back over here. They try to undo the trauma to come back this way. And this actually causes people to be stuck. So if I have like, a relationship, for example, where let's say I get divorced or my partner passes away. And if I try to recreate that relationship, if I try to undo the damage, if I try to make all of my future partners caricatures of my past partner who I loved, I'm just going to be stuck. Like it's not going to work, right? What I really have to do is make meaning of it, make sense of it, integrate the new perspective with the old perspective, and then arrive at some kind of like weird hybrid perspective. So it's the resolution of the dissonance between this thing and this thing that results in like some kind of novel perspective. So I'll give you all kind of like an example, okay? So I know we've talked about sexual assault and stuff, but I've seen this, so I'm sort of using it. Hopefully it's not, maybe I should have given a trigger warning. But people can feel confident, and after an assault, they can feel shame and weak and guilty. And now they get confused, right? Because back here, the world was a safe place, and I can be confident. But after this traumatic event, like now I feel all these things, like I don't know how to get back here. And people will try to get back there, right? But in terms of the the people who've been assaulted who do really well, I think what they actually find is that where they end up over here is like, actually, wow, I'm incredibly strong. They realize like, wow, I actually did survive a sexual assault. And like, it doesn't have to change me as a person. That I had no idea what real strength was until I lived through this experience. And I'm so much stronger now. I had no idea what the reserves of strength that I had deep within me. And then also like, now that I understand what it's like to go through this, I can help others. Right? Like now suddenly like what I can do is support other people, support other survivors. We see this with cancer as well. It's not just, sexual assault kind of stuff, but so cancer survivors will also reach out and realize, oh wow, I have a new love for life. I have a zest for life. I can help other people survive cancer. Every once a month I go to a cancer survivor support group and I help other people sort of like, I try to keep them positive. We kind of see this also in our friend from Ukraine, right? Where like, I showed no fear and suddenly like my friends are relying on me. There's a lot of strength that you don't realize that you have. So that becomes sort of this integration that we're talking about. And the resolution of that dissonance is how you sort of make meaning of things, or that's what happens when you make meaning of things, I should say. So this process over here is the meaning-making process. Okay? So the second thing that we're going to talk about is cognitive restructuring. And don't worry, at the end, we've got more concrete steps. Okay? I wish I could just break it down so easily, but we'll give you all something. So this kind of goes back to the schemas, but we're going to touch on one other element here. So remember that what happens is we have these subconscious roadmaps. And after a traumatic event, these get disrupted. And then simple tasks become hard. And this is something that I think a lot of trauma survivors don't really... once they understand this, things get way better. But there's so much self-blame for like, I should be able to do this. Like, I don't understand why asking for a promotion is so hard. I don't understand why going on a date is so hard. I don't understand why simple tasks are feel impossible. Or even doing the smallest thing takes so much energy for some people who are trauma survivors. And that's because all of these, like, all this stuff that used to be on autopilot now requires calculation, right? So everything you do, we're rerunning all the numbers and all of the calculations. So it's just exhausting. And so then what happens as we're running all these calculations, because all this stuff used to be on autopilot, right? This sort of leads to a sense of bewilderment, a lack of comprehensibility, and a lack of navigatability. So the world stops making sense, and I don't know how to navigate it anymore. Because I used to have all of my roadmaps in place. But like now that the roadmaps are disrupted, like I don't know how to get from point A to point B. So it's not just about finding an overarching meaning, but there actually has to be a cognitive restructuring that goes on again. What we actually need to do is build new roadmaps. And as we build new roadmaps, right, like these tasks will become simple again. Now, depending on how your roadmap forms, remember you could form a roadmap of I'm never going to date again after you have a bad relationship experience. Or you could have a roadmap of like, I'm going to be a little bit more careful of who I date. Both of those are new roadmaps. Both of them will allow you to date again. That helps the task become easy. But like those are going to be quite different in terms of how they affect your life. So this is where the intentionality of how you restructure your cognitive schemas becomes important. So as researchers have looked into cognitive restructuring, one of the things they sort of settled on, which is really interesting in trauma, is rumination. So rumination is repetitive thoughts. And what trauma researchers essentially found out is that there are two kinds of rumination. There's automatic or intrusive rumination. And there is intentional or reflective rumination. So let's talk about these. After you have a traumatic experience, without any control on your part, your mind will generate thoughts about the experience. These thoughts are oftentimes unasked for, unpleasant, uncontrolled. They're also repetitive. So your mind, it's almost like, I don't know if y'all are familiar with like cows chewing cud, but it's like your mind will just turn over these thoughts like over and over and over again, and they don't feel productive. They oftentimes will make you feel bad, like emotionally. And you just kind of like think these thoughts over and over and over again. Like, oh my God, like today's the day that maybe Russia will attack or whatever. So, and intrusive and automatic ruminations tend to lead to worse trauma-oriented outcomes. They're kind of bad. But this is what's really important. This is where things get super complicated because there's a lot of research on this. So people have also done studies that show that early, late, automatic, intentional. That if you look at people who do like a healthy amount of post-traumatic growth, early on they'll have automatic intrusive thoughts and then or ruminative thoughts, and over time they'll move to like intentional thoughts like later in their life. So this may be like very minimal at the beginning, and hopefully this is minimal towards the end. But that this may actually be a healthy part of the process of a healthy part of processing trauma. So it's not necessarily that automatic or intrusive ruminative thoughts are necessarily bad. There's some research that suggests that they're part of the process. They're part of the ways that you kind of like manage some of your emotions and things like that. So over time, though, what we want to actually do is like change the nature of our rumination. So instead of being automatic or intrusive, what we want to do is start being intentional. So this is what's really scary for some people, is because they don't want to think about it, right? With automatic and intrusive ruminations, like the whole goal is, if you're a patient who's suffering from trauma, or they don't have to be a patient, is that you want to stop thinking about it because they're unasked for. They're intrusive. You don't want to be thinking about it. They're repetitive. So interestingly enough, people will avoid them at all costs, whereas actually what you may want to do is be more reflective. So set aside time to think about it in a productive way. So a good example of this is like, let's say I have a bad experience and it's like, oh my God, will I be alone forever? Will I ever find love again? Oh my God, it's so bad what happened to me. It's so bad what happened to me. The next day I think the same thoughts. The next day I think the same thoughts. They're kind of just repetitive, cyclic thoughts. So instead, kind of sitting down and sort of saying like, okay, like let me think about this. Do I want to be in a relationship again? Right? Really like being introspective and reflective about it. Go climb to the top of a mountain. Sit up there for a little while and start to think like, what do I want from this life? Do I want relationships? Do I want to be alone? Do I want to be with someone else? Is the reason that I don't want to be with someone else is because I'm afraid of what happens. Okay, how am I going to manage that fear? So the real problem isn't that I need to be alone or that I need to be with someone else. What I'm really afraid of is I'm afraid of being hurt again. How do I manage that fear of being hurt? So there's sort of an intentional reflective process. This is also what therapy oftentimes does, by the way. Right? So this is kind of the advantage of therapy. They'll sort of help you through that intentional reflective process. We'll give you all more tips about this as well. But in terms of cognitive restructuring, like hopefully y'all can see that I can start off with these automatic intrusive thoughts. And as I ask myself those kinds of introspective questions, what'll happen, so this is me trusting, and this is me distrusting. And then as I go through this intentional ruminative process, right, I'm going to come to an equilibrium of like new trust, right? But no more ignoring red flags. And then once you get to this point, you can sort of see like, yeah, I used to be an idiot. And after that experience, even though it was really painful, now like I'm more aware of red flags in relationships. I don't let problems in relationships fester. And I think overall, it's like made me a better person to be in a relationship. I feel happier and more able to like manage conflict and yada, yada, yada. Okay. So we want to shift from sort of these automatic intrusive ruminations to kind of tackling our problems cognitively head on, with the goal of resolving any kind of internal dissonance and coming to a new kind of conclusion. So next thing we're going to talk about is emotions. So there are a couple of points. I'm not going to go into too much detail. There's actually so much to say about all of these things. So I want y'all to understand this is just a very, very oversimplification. I'm probably not doing it justice. There are hundreds of articles and, loads and loads of books and clinical guides and stuff like that on post-traumatic growth. So we're sort of simplifying stuff. So the first thing that I want to say about emotions is when people go through trauma, it's important to remember that the trauma takes something away from you. Right? So like, this is where the problem with trauma is that reason so many people struggle with trauma is because the tools that we use to fix other problems in our life don't apply to this situation. We can't just fix it. We can't undo it. So the trauma takes something away from you. And if you're not careful, you'll let it keep taking from you. Okay? Not saying that this is easy, but this is important to understand. So when we cultivate positive emotions, post-trauma, this is very powerful. And here's the reason why. People after a traumatic experience assume that a positive emotion is only present for that amount of time. So let's say this is my regular baseline. This is my post-trauma baseline. And what people assume is that, let's say I go to a party and I like forget for a day. I go on a weekend trip. And so my emotional state goes up and then it goes down. And then as soon as the trip ends, I go back to my post-traumatic baseline, and like that's all it does. But this is very important to understand. According to research, positive emotion has a cumulative, long-lasting effect. Huge. So if we really look at what literally the experience of positive emotion does, this is not correct. What the experience of positive emotion does is this. It actually alters your baseline. And if you kind of think about it, like that's how we got here, right? This is how we got here in the first place. So this is not actually anything new. It's just we don't really think about it. If this is my baseline and I have a traumatic experience, is this what happens? No. Right? So what happens after a traumatic experience is this. Or depending on the size of the traumatic experience, this. So this is something that I think people don't really understand about the brain and just emotional experiences, is that we tend to assume, especially for positive emotional experiences. I don't know why we have this bias towards negative. I mean, I have a couple of theories, but we just assume that if I have fun for a weekend, all it is forgetting for a weekend. It doesn't have any kind of lasting effect. It's just like a break for a weekend, but I have to come back to the same situation. Whereas actual research on post-traumatic growth and positive experiences and from positive psychology suggests that having a positive emotional experience actually has a cumulative long-lasting effect. You get a 50-point temporary buff, but then you get a 10-point permanent stat gain from a positive experience. So this is what's so devastating about people who oftentimes go through traumatic experiences, is that they let the trauma take away from them more than what it originally took, right? So since I feel so bad, I'm going to stop going to parties. Since I feel so bad, I'm not going to go to this baby shower. Since I feel so bad, I'm just going to sit at home all day. And I'm not saying that it's easy to leave the house. What I'm saying is that if you really want to understand how this stuff works, what we've discovered is that if you are able to leave this house, and if you are able to let the trauma take a little bit less away from you, chances are that it'll actually help you in the long term. Very unusual concept. I've heard no one talk about this in all of the self-help crap that I've seen. Like, no one has sort of mentioned the scientific impact of a temporary positive experience actually being more permanent in nature. Okay? We sort of know this, though, because we know that like people who seem to be, doing well in life are always kind of doing well. So one of the mechanisms for this is also that there's an upward spiral. So we know that our emotions can downward spiral, but it's interesting because it appears that our emotions work both ways, right? The circuitry is like, it goes either way. We can raise blood pressure, we can lower blood pressure. We can feel emotionally better, we can feel emotionally worse. So there are actually possibilities of upward spirals. So this is where, as best as you can, don't stop having fun. Right? I know it's hard, right? I can't imagine. I have no idea for the post that we looked at the beginning, I have no idea if you're, in the Ukraine right now, how you're supposed to be having fun. I don't know. I just don't know. But as best as you can, try to have fun. The next thing to consider when it comes to positive emotions is forgiveness. So we're not going to go into too much detail. We touched on this on our last lecture on trauma. The research here is also conflicted. So a lot of research suggests that forgiving is a healthy part of the process. Personally, I do not like to I don't like to force people to forgive. So I personally think that what's going on here is that acceptance is the real healing element here, and that one option under the umbrella of acceptance is forgiveness. But you don't have to necessarily forgive. There are some contrary perspectives, especially around, violence or sexual violence, emotional abuse, etc. Like kids who have narcissistic parents, for example, for some of them, it can be healing to forgive. But for some, forgiveness is not actually healing. And being forced into forgiveness can actually result in feelings of shame, inadequacy, and especially when we're talking about people who don't respect boundaries, like personality disordered people in your life, like siblings, parents, kids, etc. Forgiveness can actually propagate the trauma. I've seen that. So on balance, I would say that forgiveness is, generally speaking, a healthy thing. And at the same time, it's not necessary. I think personally what I find is necessary is acceptance. And forgiveness and acceptance oftentimes go hand in hand, because you can't forgive until you accept, right? You have to accept that someone has hurt you. You can't make excuses for them. You can't be in denial that you've been hurt in order to forgive, because if they haven't done anything wrong, there's nothing to forgive. If there's nothing to forgive, then you're potentially in denial of the damage that's been done. So, forgiveness is something that if you can forgive, if that feels right to you, then by all means do it. I do think that for the majority of people, forgiveness is, generally speaking, a net positive, like letting things go is a net positive. And at the same time, there are a couple of caveats there that we have to be careful. And I don't want to say, or I don't feel confident saying that forgiveness is a necessary a necessary part of the emotional experience that you have to go through. Okay? So, now we get to the end. Facilitating post-traumatic growth. Okay, so there are 5 steps to facilitating post-traumatic growth. The first is education. Okay, so when someone goes through a traumatic experience, I'm tempted to just switch over to camera here for a second. So we're just going to talk about this. Maybe we'll summarize towards the end. So the first thing is education. When people experience trauma, they don't know what to expect. And because things get really hard, right? So simple tasks become difficult. They don't really understand what the hell is going on with them. They don't understand why they can't sleep, where the insomnia is coming from. They don't understand why they feel randomly anxious all the time. They don't understand that it is normal to feel out of control. It is normal to feel hopeless. So what happens is there's almost this double doozy. There's it's like a double tap of one is I have the traumatic experience, but the way that I'm responding to the traumatic experience makes me feel incompetent. Because suddenly, I don't know what is wrong with me. And so the first thing that we have to do is help people understand that what you're feeling is actually a neurobiological and physiologic process, which has nothing to do with you doing a bad job. Because what happens when people get traumatized is they feel like they're doing a bad job. They're oh my God, I'm so confused. I can't even go to a party anymore. I can't even talk to my friends. I'm so confused. I don't understand what the hell is wrong with me. People feel incredibly broken. And it's their lack of understanding that being broken is literally part of the process of healing through trauma that they just don't get yet. So the first thing to do is just share with them that you're supposed to feel disoriented. You're going to have a lot of trouble making sense of things for the next couple days to weeks to months, right? That there's all kinds of physiologic processes that could be going on as well. Your body is in a high alert system. You're going to have difficulty sleeping. You're going to have adrenaline like pumping through your system at random times. And these are all like actually normal. So you're not fucked up in some way, right? This is literally how the body responds to a trauma. Just like if I have a broken bone, I'm going to get a lot of swelling and pain, which seems like worse than the broken bone itself. But that is a natural part of the healing process. Similarly, when you have an insult to your psyche in some way that's traumatic, there's going to be a lot of like inflammation and swelling that's like psychospiritual in nature. And that's in turn is going to be very painful and disorienting. And that's actually okay. It's part of the process. It's going to get better with time. So first thing is to educate people, right? Just let them know, hey, you're not screwed up or broken in some way. It's like literally how your mind and body copes with this issue. So what's going on in your mind? And this is where you can explain all the crap that we've explained today, which is that your mind used to have these schemas. Like you had a way of navigating the world on autopilot. Your brain can't do that anymore. So now a lot of simple tasks are going to feel hard. That's normal. Your brain is actually rewiring as we speak. We're going to try to help it rewire in a healthy way, okay? Second thing is the management of emotional distress, okay? This is also really important. So when we come to management of emotional distress. So as we get through steps 3 through 5, these cannot happen if someone is emotionally distressed, okay? And so I want y'all to kind of understand this. Like you can't, if you want to like do this introspective work, right, of like discovering meaning in life, like, oh my God, let's discover meaning. You can't do that if you're having a panic attack. The cognitive work, the meaning making, the restructuring, all of this stuff has to happen once you're kind of emotionally calm. And even if we go back to like the automatic ruminations versus the intentional ruminations, remember that research even suggests that early on, the automatic ruminations are actually like a normal part of the process potentially. So we have to help people emotionally. So we have to help them with their anxiety. We have to help them with their insomnia. We have to help them with intrusive ruminations and coping with those. While these kinds of, while you're emotionally distressed, you can't really focus on like growth or making sense of things. So this is where therapy can be very helpful, but all kinds of other emotional management kind of tools can also be helpful. Going for walks, spending time in nature, meditating, seeing a licensed professional, like spending time with friends, cultivating some positive emotion that we just talked about. So managing your emotional distress is critical. And we also know from lots of research on, refugees and things like that, that like you can't do any kind of psychological debriefing if people are not like safe. So safety kind of comes first. You have to give people food. You have to give people shelter. You have to stop the panic attack. You have to help them sleep at night. And then once all that kind of stuff gets somewhat under control, then you can start doing some of the later stuff, okay? Okay. Next up. Let me just see how we do it on time. Okay. All right. So next up, we've got self-disclosure. Okay. Now, this is going to, I want to be able to define this kind of carefully. So what I mean by self-disclosure is not that you have to tell people what happened to you. So we don't want to encourage actually people to like share their traumas with other people. What I mean by self-disclosure is you have to disclose your experience in some way. You don't have to, but generally speaking, this is what the data suggests. That sharing or externalizing what happened to you is a key way of like processing your stuff, okay? So let's think a little bit about what happens in the mindset of someone who's been traumatized. It's confusing, right? Like, I don't know how to navigate the world. I don't know how to make sense of things. Simple tasks are difficult. I feel like I'm screwing up. I don't know what's wrong with me. There are all kinds of these automatic intrusive thoughts that are flooding in my head. Like, it's just overwhelming. There's just way too much going on. So when we take that crap and we put it out into the world in some fashion, it must get organized in some way. And that organizational process is critical to dealing with those feelings of being overwhelmed. So I'll give you all an example. So the simplest example is like therapy, right? So in therapy, it's like, in order to articulate your experience, and as a therapist talks to you, you're gonna like have to put those pieces of the puzzle together, right? So if a therapist asks you, if we kind of go back to this for a second, if we go back to this, remember, this is the self that gets fractured, and a therapist asks me, who were you before? Who are you now? In order to answer those questions, I have to, in order to articulate and tell them, okay, who am I now, right? I may not have an answer right away. Like, I'll have to say, like, I'll have to organize the pieces of myself in some way in order to answer the question. So even the process of articulation requires the organization of your thoughts. The organization of your thoughts will in turn deal with the internal sense of being overwhelmed and like not making any sense of anything, because as you talk to someone, you're going to have to organize and articulate things. So when you kind of do that, that in of itself appears to be like very, very helpful from that cognitive restructuring standpoint. Now that disclosure could be with a licensed therapist. It could be like survivor groups or support groups. It could be with like emotionally supportive friends, family, things like that. Once again, the important thing about the self-disclosure, this is important, is that the data does not suggest, at least based on what I've looked at, that you have to share the details of your traumatic experience. So it's not like you have to psychologically debrief. In fact, some studies have found that that's actually harmful. So you don't have to go and like go through all the details of what happened to you, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I felt this, and then this person did this. That's not actually what disclosure is. Disclosure is like taking whatever is inside of you and organizing it. The way that you think about yourself, the way that you think about other people, the way that you think about the world, organizing those thoughts and putting them out in some format. So it could be through something like talk therapy, but this is also where there's a bunch of other stuff which appears to be helpful. So remember, the goal is to organize stuff and put it out into the world in some format. It could be writing a letter. It could be putting something in your diary. It could be the creation of art. There's a lot of evidence that shows that art therapy can be very, very helpful. So sometimes people are not quite as articulate or quite as verbal. So a very good friend of mine, for example, is an awesome child and adolescent psychiatrist. And she works with like adolescents who don't really know how to, you know, their vocabulary isn't great. Their internal understanding of themselves is not really great. But she uses art very effectively because they can paint a picture in a way that cannot describe what they're feeling. So it appears that venting and organizing some of that internal crap can be very, very helpful in terms of healing. And that's what we mean by self-disclosure. So you can also share, you know, with friends and family and stuff like that as well. Okay? So maybe disclosure is, yeah, okay. So step number 4, okay, is developing a narrative. Now, this narrative is more about the self. So this is like, what we want to do here is develop a sense of self that incorporates the trauma. So this is like who I was before the trauma, right? And then like, this is me during the trauma. And this is me after the trauma. I just feel really tiny. So this is the pre-event self. This is the during event. And this is the aftermath. So what we need to do is develop a narrative for ourselves. So this is like, who am I and who have I become going forward? So how do I like live life in this direction? Because this is what I used to be. And then I was on this trajectory, but then this trajectory is no longer possible because of this event. So how do I develop like the right trajectory going forward? So this is where, for example, like thinking about cancer survivors is a really good, is the best example of this. So if we think about cancer survival, like that's an identity, right? We'll have like people who then start going on running on marathons and like running marathons and things like that. Like once you become a cancer survivor, I mean, even the fact that there's a term for it, right? It's like, I'm a cancer survivor. I was in the Holocaust. And we sort of saw that if you were in our last lecture on like trauma, is that as people like formulate a new sense of identity, it helps them like develop a road forward because the internal self is fractured. And if you don't know who you are, it becomes very hard to navigate the world because like you don't know who you are. And so as we develop a narrative for ourselves, so that's like sort of asking ourselves questions like, who was I before? Who was I during the event? How did that event change me? And what does this mean for my future? So it's sort of developing a narrative around what happened to you and why it happened to you. So the narrative that I use for, nowhere near, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, but like when I was failing out of college, like I've integrated that into my narrative. So and y'all probably know that, right? So I'll self-disclose a fair amount, right? So even now I'll share parts of my life and I find that to be like helpful for me. It's helpful for me to formulate that into a narrative of like who I am, what my life is, what direction I'm going, how it informs the future going forward. So you have to develop a narrative for yourself. Okay? And then the last thing is develop a sense of purpose. So, remember, this part is about developing the self. This is about interacting with the world and to a certain degree relationships. Okay? So when we're talking about developing a sense of purpose, so once you consolidate your identity, once you consolidate your experience into a new you, then this you has to interact with the world in some way. And so like oftentimes what you'll see from trauma survivors is that who they are then informs the way that they interact with the rest of the world. And we can actually see this like with cancer survivors, right? So then what happens is I survived cancer and now going forward, I'm going to do the marathons. I'm going to raise awareness. I'm going to help other people who are going through what I've gone through. And we can even see this I realize now that I'm a strong person. Oh my God, this is just getting terrible. I'm a strong person that I can help others, right? And that sort of newfound sense of purpose is kind of dictated by the sense of identity that is developed in step 4. And so this is where sometimes like what happens is people will like, if you haven't done this part, it becomes really hard to do that part because who are you? Like, what is this for? Like what does this mean for your future? Like you kind of have to figure out who you are before you really think about helping the world. And we can even see this in this person's kind of story, right? So we can see that like, as many people left, I took responsibility. Like I sort of changed. I started telling people what, although it's hard, I showed no fear and only courage and confidence. I became their source of motivation and confidence. It had never happened in my peaceful part of life. It has changed. So as we go back to this, what we can actually see is like all of these steps in this story. So I'm so happy that this person decided to share their story with us because I think it's an incredible story. And so this is where kind of that meaning making phase kind of steps in because now that you know who you are, like what are you going to do for the rest of the world? And as you do that, suddenly like then things are integrated, right? So you used to be fractured and now you've moved beyond fracturing to a point of integration. And that's when we sort of achieved post-traumatic growth. Okay? All right. So just to summarize, trauma's tricky. The trickiest thing about trauma is that most of the time when we are faced with a problem as human beings, we try to fix it. But it is the nature of traumatic events that we cannot go back in time and undo them. So it's like, if something, let's say my dog passes away, I can get a new dog, but that doesn't fix the hurt from the old dog. We can't really fix trauma. So trauma affects us in a lot of ways. It affects our sense of identity. This is who I was, and now I don't know who I am anymore. It affects the way that we relate to other people. It affects the way that we think about other people. So the world is safe before I was traumatized, and now who knows? Right? For people who are caught in war conflict, like I've lived here my whole life and it has been safe. Now it's not safe anymore. So even if this person moves to a different country, there'll be a lingering sense of like safety can be taken away at any moment. So it changes the way that we relate to other people. It changes the way that we relate to the world. All of the schemas that we developed, all of the playbooks that we use to live our life get fractured by trauma. If we're not careful, our mind will fix it kind of on its own, but much like a broken bone, it can mend crooked. And that's oftentimes what we see with trauma, is that like they'll coalesce eventually, but the way that they coalesce may have some, parts that are kind of bent out of shape. So what are the key components to like building yourself up the right way? The first is that it appears that meaning making is very, very important to achieve post-traumatic growth. So you have to make sense of stuff. There's also an element of cognitive restructuring. Remember that our brain has all these schemas that it uses to navigate the world. If I meet someone at a party, can I trust this person or not? Do I need to worry about pickpockets when I go to my friend's place? And so all of these like schemas need to be restructured cognitively. There's a lot of like dissonance that goes on because this is the way the world used to be. This is the way the world is now. I don't know how to make sense of these two things. Making sense of those two things involves a cognitive restructuring process, developing a new playbook, and then suddenly like things become easy again because I know how to navigate the world. There's also a lot of emphasis on emotions. So this is a key kind of takeaway that I want to share with y'all, which I think is very interesting, is that the experience of positive emotion is not just a temporary thing that then goes away. We have this perception that if I have a good weekend and I go back to my life, the life is unchanged. But the truth is that negative emotions have lingering effects and positive emotions have lingering effects. Even experiencing positive emotion for a single weekend appears to have some kind of lasting effect over time, and that those are cumulative and can build up. So if trauma can take certain things away from you, but just because trauma took one dog away from you does not mean you should stop having fun with a new dog. And if you want to go get a puppy and enjoy spending time with that puppy. And that in and of itself will be part of the healing process if it's the right move for you, obviously. So there's also upward spirals of positive emotion in the same way that there are negative spirals of positive emotion. And lastly, that forgiveness tends to be an important piece that is well studied. Not necessarily that you need to forgive, because there's also some data that suggests that forgiving can be negative, but that in my opinion, acceptance is really kind of the forgiveness version of forgiveness that everyone should do. And that forgiveness can be a part of that. But the data does seem to suggest that the majority of people who forgive after a traumatic event are themselves healthier as a result. So those are kind of three things, right? We have to take care of meaning, we have to take care of our mind and our cognitive thoughts, and we have to take care of our emotions. Now, in terms of what are the steps of actually achieving post-traumatic growth, the data largely focuses on 5 things. Right? These are oversimplifications. The first is like education, because after a traumatic event, people feel like they feel incompetent. They're like, I should be able to do this. I can't believe I can't sleep. What's wrong with me? People feel broken and incompetent. And to help them understand that feeling of brokenness is a natural consequence of the injury you've sustained. So just like your arm feels broken after a car accident, your mind is going to feel kind of broken after this event. And that's okay, and it will heal over time. That what you're experiencing is not a deficiency of character, it's a natural consequence of neurobiology and physiology. Second thing to consider is emotional distress. That some of the later steps that we're talking about are very difficult to do if people are actively emotionally distressed. So we have to support their emotional distress either through clinical means, meditation, going for long walks, whatever. Right? So your mind has to be calm to do some of this like more intensive work of introspection and figuring out who you are and all this good stuff. Next thing that's important is disclosure or self-disclosure. Now, oftentimes people will assume this means you have to tell people about the details of your trauma. That's not what it means at all. And in fact, there's data that suggests that sometimes forcing people to psychologically debrief or going through their trauma with them makes things worse. It just causes re-experiencing. So in terms of disclosure about the traumatic event, that should always be dictated by the person. So if you feel comfortable doing it, that's fine. If you don't want to do it, you don't ever have to do it. And you can heal fully without telling a single soul. But, I mean, I can't say that 100% for all people, but I believe that. But organizing the absolute hurricane in your mind does seem to be very important. So you feel overwhelmed, you don't know how to make sense of the world, you don't know who you are, you don't know how you're going to relate to other people, you don't know what to expect from the world. Sharing those thoughts is important. So you don't have to share those thoughts with a therapist necessarily, but highly recommended if you guys have been through a serious traumatic event that you go see a therapist. Because they're going to help you. When they ask you questions, you're going to take all the disorganized pieces of your mind that have been fractured, and you have to articulate them. And as you articulate them, you are going to be organizing them in your head. So that can be helpful. But that sort of disclosure doesn't necessarily have to be a therapist. It can be with peers, peer support groups, friends, whatever. It doesn't even have to be with a person. So there's evidence that shows that writing in your diary, writing a letter, making music, making art are just as effective. I can't say technically just as effective because I haven't actually compared the effect sizes for these sorts of things. But, those can be effective as well. The key thing is that you take what is inside you and disorganized, organize it, and put it out into the world in some place. Not that it has to be seen by another human being, heard by another human being, touched by another human being. You can write a letter and then burn it. But writing that letter is incredibly important. Next thing is develop a narrative. So remember that trauma fractures the sense of self. This is who I am. And then this event happens and it changes who I am. And what does this mean for who I am going forward and how I live my life going forward? Because this is the trajectory I was on. I was doing this, I was doing this, I was doing this, and then this thing happened, and now my life has completely changed. So you have to reformulate that narrative. Who are you, right? What does this mean for me? And reformulating that narrative is a really, really important part of putting yourself back together. And it's not that we're going to return to the old you. In fact, what we want is integrate into a new you, which bizarrely, even after this event, will be stronger, better, able to help more people. And once you know who you are, you move on to the last step, which is meaning and purpose. This is where you take who you are and you direct it to the rest of the world. What does this mean for the other people in my life? What does this mean for people who come after me? Am I going to write a book about this experience? Am I going to help other people, my friends, soldiers in my unit? Am I going to raise funds for other cancers, other people who get diagnosed with cancer? So finding some sense of meaning or purpose. And interestingly enough, once you get to that phase, then you're actually like stronger than when you ever started off. And this is what you'll hear from people who go through difficult experiences, is that I'm stronger as a result of this. And so that's post-traumatic growth. Quick overview. So last disclaimer is that, this is a simplification of an amazingly deep, complex, and not fully understood field. At the same time, we've tried to do our best today to sort of explain a little bit how it works. And this is something that I think honestly has been missing, because you'll get a lot of people talking about PTSD, right? These are the symptoms of PTSD. If you look at WebMD or some other website, they'll talk about these insomnia, nightmares, that's fine. That's useful information. But the cool thing is that as research on positive psychology has grown, as research has grown, as people have acknowledged that difficult experiences can actually make us better human beings, we can tunnel down into, okay, what about a difficult process or difficult experience can turn me into a better human being versus a crippled human being, right? What is the crippling factor and what is the growing factor? And so that's why I really wanted to share this with y'all today. And it just so happened that karmically, we had someone in our community post about their personal experience of this process. Okay? We've got time for maybe one question. So Bearclaw123, who's saying this is probably my favorite topic so far, that's why we did it. This all seems to have limited applications for CPTSD. Could you explore that topic? Sure. But I don't know that it has limited applications for CPTSD. I would say actually quite the opposite. So I think CPTSD, for those of you who don't know, is complex PTSD. So generally speaking, when we talk about trauma, there is a short time window of events, usually. So what researchers have discovered is when you get traumatized over and over and over again for long periods of time, what happens to the person is different from a single event, right? So there's like a difference between like war happening for a 3-month period where I live, which can be long enough, I suppose, versus growing up like in a war-torn area, right? Like growing up for decades in places where like conflict is constant. So this is sort of like I had one traumatic experience. I was like, I was mugged, which is like a single trauma, versus like I was physically abused growing up, like every single day I used to get hit. So those two things manifest in like different ways. And this is where, I think that the post-traumatic growth perspective, I hope is helpful and applicable to people with CPTSD. But remember that CPTSD is going to be like a little bit different in terms of its manifestation, its character, the sense of self. So the tricky thing, just to give you all an example. So remember with this model, what we're sort of saying is that there's a sense of self that is cohesive. Traumatic event happens, sense of self gets shattered. And then we have to re-put it together. The problem with CPTSD is the first sense of self was formulated through a series of traumatic events, right? So it's not like that is what happens in CPTSD is it is a stitching together of components in a bad way, basically. So it's sort of like if we don't go down the post-traumatic growth path. But having worked with some people with CPTSD, what I've found is that a lot of the stuff is like in a sense the same. We still want to develop a healthy narrative for our lives. We want to develop meaning. We want to develop purpose. We have to manage emotional distress. We need to explain to people, hey, you're not like screwed up fundamentally. The reason your mind works this way, the reason your body reacts this way is because it's a natural consequence of the things that have happened to you. And also that just because these things have happened to you and you are in this place does not mean that this is what you're doomed for the rest of your life. That the trajectory in the aftermath of your experiences can be changed and you can shape the nature of your life going forward. But it's going to be hard, and cut yourself some slack. Okay, well, so Unload Led said, has helped you a lot. You're very welcome. That's why we did. I think it's been something that we've been trying to find time to do. I think that's the real challenge, is like there's just so much stuff to talk about. We were talking about ADHD a lot recently. We haven't talked about depression and anxiety in a long time because that stuff is in Dr. K's guide. But yeah, so someone's asking, are meds okay? Sure. Like if they're, so any treatment should be determined by like you and a medical professional, right? So as a psychiatrist, sometimes I prescribe medication. Sometimes it's very helpful. It's just a tool, just like any other. Okay. All right. So I don't think we have time for meditation today because I got to run. I'm going to think a little bit about meditation that's appropriate to this topic. Let me think for a second. If we have time for something short. Okay, so we're going to do a quick gratitude practice, okay? So this is going to be a little bit different, but in the vein of cultivating positive emotion. We're going to do just a very, very simple gratitude practice, okay? So I'm going to ask y'all to sit up straight and go ahead and close your eyes and take a moment to just acclimatize yourself to your breathing. Just notice your breath. This is a good practice to tack on to other sort of more active practices like alternate nostril breathing or Om chanting. So what I'm going to do is just center myself for a moment by focusing on the sound of my breath. Tune into the sound. Try to appreciate every quality within it. Where the sound is generated from. The different nuances as the sound changes over the course of the inhalation. The difference between inhalation and exhalation. And now I want you to think about a single person in your life that you have even the tiniest shred of gratitude towards. If it's a lot of gratitude, that's totally fine. But even the smallest person who's made, or the person who's made even the smallest positive impact, anything that you can be grateful for. Just imagine that person for a moment. And then think for a moment about what you are grateful for that that person has done for you. And now what I want you to do is imagine that person as a tiny star in the sky. And imagine yourself looking up towards that star and just appreciating, in the simplest way, just how beautiful a star is. And that your world is just a tiny bit brighter because of that person's existence. And appreciate what that person has done for you. And now think about another person, a second person, or animal, something in this world that you appreciate, something that you are grateful for because of what that thing has done for you. Whether it's a pet or a person, a friend online, or family member in real life, or even a waiter or waitress who gave you extra sauce for your tendies on the house. And imagine that person too is a star in the sky, shining its light, and appreciate what that has done for you. Express gratitude and give thanks. And now we'll think of a third person who has done something for you that you're grateful of. And imagine them as a star as well, and bask in the light. Express gratitude towards that person. Acknowledge what they've done for you and how it has helped you. And over time, as you do this practice, I want you to appreciate that the number of people who have helped you are just as populous as stars in the sky. And every time you do this practice, fill in the blank night of the sky with a little bit of gratitude, little points of light, small kindnesses or big kindnesses. You may find a moon somewhere in there, shining a lot of light down on you. But that even in your life, if things look bleak, the more that you really pay attention, the more you'll find that there are people in your life who are illuminating your darkness. And express appreciation and gratitude towards each and every one. Acknowledge the little things in your life that make things just a little bit better. Everything from a patch that buffed your favorite champion or hero, to bug fixes, to favorite authors that write books that'll allow you to enjoy and escape the world from time to time, to artists who have labored to create music, to family or friends or roommates who make you meals, to pets who will give you love and affection. And feel how tiny you are on this earth, surrounded by 1,000 stars, each shining their light down on you. A whole host of people who have endeavored through their effort to make your life a tiny bit better. And give thanks. Go ahead and come on back. And remember that though things may seem bleak, though things may seem hopeless, there's a lot to be grateful for in this world. There's a lot of evil in the world. There's a lot of badness in the world. There's a lot of fear in the world. There's a lot of things to be worried about. And there's a lot to appreciate. There's a lot to be grateful for. So someone's asking, is it okay if one of the stars is me, myself? That's a wonderful question. What do you think? You're probably the most important star, but for some people, the hardest to find. So, who are we rating, chat? No, where'd I go? Josija? Can we rate someone small? Small spec streamer? Nice wig. Let's look at that. By the way, thanks for all the gifted subs and whatnot, y'all. We appreciate you. Olesia Beletka. Okay, looks like an IRL streamer that has 1,000 people. Nice wig. Let's find someone smaller. Tiny small spec streamer. Okay, also big. Renexa. Okay, there we go. Let's raid Renexa. Apparently Renexa passed the exam and got the vaccine and is doing a charity stream tomorrow. So Renexa it is. So we'll see y'all on Friday. Take care and take care of yourselves.